Hi, hello, yo, what's up? Welcome back to Chai Collective, and in episode 4, I present to you Under Pressure, which, by the way, I love David Bowie. I recently learned that he didn't have heterochromia, and his eyes were not two different colors, but it was just his left pupil being dilated. So I found that out far too late, but alas, I know now. But with that being put aside, this episode will be talking about the psychology of stress, and I hope you find this episode kind of interesting because, as we know, none of us are immune to stress, and the word itself, stress, carries a lot of negative connotations. But as we'll learn today, stress isn't always a negative thing, and in many ways it could be channeled in positive ways. And I hope to discuss that a little bit more in today's episode. Alright, so to set the scene, I'd like to ask you to take a moment and think about the last time you felt genuinely stressed. Maybe it was the night before a final exam, or maybe you were refreshing your email while waiting for an important decision, or you were sitting outside an interview room or standing at the front of a classroom before giving a presentation. Whatever the situation was, you probably remember more than just the event itself. You remember the feeling. Your heart was beating a little faster, your shoulders felt tense, and your thoughts raced ahead, imagining conversations that hadn't happened yet and outcomes that didn't even exist. Stress feels so immediate that we rarely question where it comes from. We point to the exam, the deadline, the interview, or the presentation and conclude that those situations are what made us feel stressed. But psychology offers a surprisingly different perspective. If stress were created entirely by the situation itself, then everyone in the same circumstance should experience it in a roughly similar way. Yet that is definitely not what happens. Two students, for example, can walk into the same exam with the same amount of preparation and leave with completely different emotional experiences. One spends the rest of the day convinced that they failed, and the other shrugs and accepts that it's over and just moves on. And this is interesting since the situation is identical, but the experience isn't. So, with that being said, what explains the difference? When psychologists study stress, they quickly encounter a problem. Stress isn't something that you can observe directly under a microscope or measure with a ruler. Instead, it's deeply subjective. And two people, like we mentioned, can experience the exact same life event and describe it in completely different ways. Interestingly enough, researchers have developed several tools to estimate stress, and one of them is the College Undergraduate Stress Scale, or abbreviated as CUS, and rather than measuring stress directly, it assigns values to major life events that students commonly experience over the course of a year, such as moving away from home, changing majors, financial difficulties, failing a course, or losing someone close to them. And what I find most interesting isn't the number the scale produces, but it's what the scale quietly acknowledges, that stress rarely comes from one dramatic life-changing event. More often, it's cumulative, in the sense that it builds up over time. It's the assignment that's due tomorrow, the lack of sleep from the night before, the upcoming exam, or the family obligation over the weekend, and the dozens of small decisions you make throughout the day. None of those experiences, on their own, may seem overwhelming, but together they slowly increase the mental load that we are carrying until even a small inconvenience feels like way too much. Even so, a scale like the CUS can only tell us how many stressful events someone has experienced, but it can't fully explain why those events affect one person so differently from another. And to answer that question, psychologists began looking somewhere else, not at specific events, but rather how people think about them. And one of the most influential ideas in stress psychology comes from a psychologist, Richard Lazarus, who proposed the theory of cognitive appraisal. And his central argument was remarkably simple. It was that before we experience stress, our brain first evaluates what is happening. That evaluation usually takes place so quickly that we don't even notice it, and within seconds, our mind begins asking questions like, is this a threat? Can I handle this? What happens if things don't go the way I hope? And our answers shape our emotional response long before the situation has actually unfolded. Imagine you're about to open the results of a very important exam, and the grade hasn't appeared yet. Objectively, nothing has happened, yet your mind is already working. One person immediately imagines failure. What if I did terribly? What if this ruins my GPA? And what if everyone else did better than I did? And someone else has a completely different internal conversation with themselves. Whatever happens, I'll figure out my next step. One grade doesn't define everything I've learned. Or I'll deal with the outcome once I know what it is. Sure enough, the exam hasn't changed and the score hasn't changed. The only thing that's different between the two is interpretation. And that's enough to produce two completely different experiences of stress. And this idea also helps explain why uncertainty often feels so exhausting. Human beings naturally want answers. When we don't know what's going to happen, our minds fill in the blanks, often with the worst case scenarios, as many of us have probably experienced. And ironically, once we know the final outcome, even if it isn't the one we hoped for, that uncertainty disappears. The situation may still be disappointing, but it's no longer unknown. And I've started noticing this process in everyday situations that seem almost too ordinary to think about. Take traffic, for example. Objectively, traffic is just a line of slow-moving cars. Yet our reactions to it can be completely different. One person spends the drive replaying everything that could go wrong. They're imagining themselves arriving late, disappointing someone, making a bad first impression, or falling behind schedule. Every minute feels increasingly frustrating because it represents another minute that they can't control. Someone else recognizes that traffic is inconvenient, but also realizes that worrying won't make the cars move any faster. They send a quick text message saying they'll be late, turn on some music, or tune in to a super cool podcast like Chai Collective, and accept the situation for what it is. Sure enough, the road is the same, and the delay is also the same, but the experience is entirely different because each person is telling themselves a different story about what is happening. And that's exactly what the cognitive appraisal really comes down to. Stress isn't determined solely by our circumstances, but it's shaped by the meaning we assign to those circumstances. Of course, the way we interpret situations isn't random. Our personalities influence those interpretations long before we are even aware of them. For decades, psychologists described two broad personality patterns known as type A and type B personalities. People with type A personalities tend to be ambitious, competitive, highly organized, and constantly aware of time. They often set demanding expectations for themselves and feel a strong sense of urgency in everyday life. And those qualities can certainly contribute to achievement, but they can also make ordinary setbacks feel much larger than they actually are. Now, type B personalities, on the other hand, approach many of the same situations differently. They are generally more patient, more relaxed, and less driven by constant competition. That doesn't mean that they lack ambition, it simply means that they often experience pressure without immediately interpreting it as a crisis. One of the reasons these personality types have become so well known is because researchers found an unexpected connection between personality and physical health. Individuals with type A characteristics, so the more competitive, ambitious, and highly organized people, were significantly more likely to develop coronary heart disease than those with type B personalities, which are typically known as being more patient and laid back. And later research suggested that the greatest risk wasn't ambition itself, but chronic hostility, which is the tendency to respond to everyday frustrations with persistent anger, impatience, or resentment. Today, psychologists recognize that personality is far more nuanced than simply dividing people into two categories. Most of us are somewhere between. And another pattern that has attracted increasing attention is what's known as the hardy personality, which is sometimes called the type H personality. People with type H personalities don't necessarily experience less stress. Rather, they tend to interpret stressful situations differently. Rather than immediately viewing challenges as threats, they're more likely to see them as opportunities to learn or problems that can be solved. They believe that although they can't control everything that happens, they usually have some control over how they respond. And that mindset changes everything. Instead of asking, why is this happening to me? They're more likely to ask, what's the next step? And sure enough, the challenge hasn't disappeared, but it has become something to work through rather than something to fear. As I learned about these personality patterns, I realized that I personally don't fit neatly into either type A or type B or even type H. I enjoy setting goals, staying organized, and challenging myself, but I don't usually see stress as something entirely negative. And in many situations, I notice that a moderate amount of pressure actually helps me focus. As deadlines approach, distractions seem to fade into the background because my priorities become much clearer. Now, that doesn't mean I enjoy feeling stressed. It simply means that I've gradually stopped viewing every stressful situation as a sign that something is wrong, and instead I've started seeing certain kinds of stress as signals that it's time to prepare, to adapt, to move forward, and to finally do the thing that I've been pushing back for so long. And I think experience plays an important role in that shift. The first time we do something unfamiliar, whether it's giving a presentation, interviewing for a job, or taking a difficult class, the uncertainty itself creates stress. But after enough repetition, something changes. The presentation isn't necessarily easier, the interview isn't necessarily shorter. Instead, we've simply become more familiar with the experience, and familiarity has a remarkable way of reducing uncertainty. Perhaps that's one of the most reassuring lessons psychology offers. Stress isn't fixed. Our relationships with stress is dynamic and is constantly changing. As we gain experience, we develop confidence and learn healthier ways of interpreting challenges and situations that once felt overwhelming and far too hard to manage. That doesn't mean that life itself becomes easier. It means we become better equipped to meet its expectations. And with all of that being said, maybe the goal isn't to eliminate stress altogether. For many people, stress is a catalyst in motivating themselves to get what they have to get done. Stress serves an important purpose. It motivates us to prepare, to solve problems, and to pay attention when something truly matters. And without stress, we might never push ourselves to grow. So maybe the goal is to simply understand stress than to try to avoid it. Because before stress becomes a racing heartbeat or restless thoughts, it usually begins as something much quieter, a prediction, an interpretation, a story that we tell ourselves about what might happen next. Psychology reminds us that while we can't always control the situations we face, we often have more influence over those stories than we realize. And sometimes changing the story is enough to change the experience. And with that being said, that's a wrap for episode 4 of Chai Collective. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I'll see you in the next one.